watching a brand new edition of The Big Picture with me, Frank Pereira. The historic mandate won by the BJP-led National Alliance has raised hopes that the new government will launch the long overdue painful reforms that are required to take India to the next level of economic development. The low-hanging fruit have been plucked. The government now faces tough choice. Should be. Joining me on the program today are Santosh Tiwari, Senior Director, FICCI, Jayant Das Gupta, former Ambassador of India at the WTO, and Sunil Jain, Managing Editor of the Financial Express. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. Pastor, let me start the program with you. So let's try and figure out where India's economy stands as we speak today, and what are the big challenges facing India's economy.
I think the growth figures may be, debated, but India is one of the fastest growing economies amongst the emerging markets, amongst all developing countries. So that is a given. The second thing is that all over the world, barring economies like perhaps the US, the signs are there that there is a slowdown, which is in the offing. It may take 6 months or 1 year according to experts, but it may not also come through in case there is concerted action by the major countries together. So there are these external signals that there is a global slowdown which could be averted if there is concerted action. On the domestic front, I think the major challenges are about attracting investments, because unless we have investments, gross domestic capital formation, for instance, has been sluggish. It is just around 30%. It was slightly lower last year, but we used to have about 34-35%, and that is something which we should aim for, and we must create the conditions so that we can have the investments from the domestic arena flow into expansion. That will create jobs, that will create consumption, and that will give a fillip to overall growth. So that is, I think, should all these banks needs to be cleaned up, and the stressed assets have to be taken out so that they have far more freedom to lend.
Sure.
So these are the two major things which, and of course the third point which I would like to mention is that we need to simplify many of our taxation provisions. For instance, the GST, people have said, is still far too complicated, and there should be ideally 2 rates or 1 rate if possible.
Sure.
2 rates is something which we can aim for, and the exempt items should be brought in under the GST scheme so that there is no problem in complying.
Right.
The compliance costs have to come down for the GST for general trade.
Right.
And so the last point, while I am on it, is that the corporate income tax needs to come down. About 7,000 of the largest companies still have not been benefited by this 25% corporate income tax. That needs to come down across the board for all companies.
Okay. Let's take the discussion forward and focus on the short term first. First 100 days, let's keep that as the first landmark. Sunil Jain, I'd like to come to you. As far as the new finance minister is concerned, what should her agenda be for the first 100 days?
Well, I think her agenda is pretty straightforward to begin with for the first 100 days. Certainly, I think the big stuff that she has to do, she has to focus a lot on tax reform. Clearly she has to get the GST Council, persuade the GST Council like the way Mr. Jaitley did to lower the number of items in the higher tax brackets. She needs to get her to work on direct tax reform, because if you look at in the past, this government financed a lot of its capital investment through a tax bonanza. That bonanza is almost over now, and we have very high tax rates for people. I think people who earn about 10 lakh rupees a year end up paying a 30-32% tax rate, which is very, very high at the personal income tax level. So I think her big focus area clearly has to be that. But I think more than that, the finance minister is actually the champion. Is the economic minister of the country. It's not just the finance ministry where he or she is looking at. So she needs to be, convincing the Prime Minister that you have to move fast on PSU, on privatization, you have to move fast on, on removing subsidies. So there's a whole agenda out there that, she needs to, keep in mind. I think the backdrop to this is the GDP numbers which will be coming out, probably an hour or so from now, which will show that your fourth quarter GDP is growing at about 5.8 to 6%. So there's been a dramatic slowdown, and what is compounding the slowdown is that because of the NBFC crisis, the overall lending in the country has slowed down a lot. So it's going to take a long time to actually get out of this growth crisis. And what the finance minister needs to do is to convince the Prime Minister that we need to push ahead with reform. But just one little quick point I want to make is that you mentioned that India needs to bite the bullet and take painful steps, do the painful reforms. I think there's a lot of low-hanging fruit that's still left, and there's a lot of painless reforms. So I'll give you an example. You look at the mining sector. If India was to open it up and to lower the levies, the mining sector will boom. There's a lot of investment that can be made there. That applies to the oil sector. If in telecom the levies are reduced, you can have a big boom in investment. So there's still a lot of low-hanging fruit, and it's not all painful reform. There is painful reform, but we can get a lot done without the painful reform also. Yeah.
Okay, a lot can be done without the painful reforms. There are still several low-hanging fruit that can be tapped, is what the expert is suggesting. Let me go across to Santosh Tiwari. Now, on this issue of external headwinds. Now, how can we address that? What does India need to do to safeguard against the external headwinds?
See, as particularly about the external headwinds, the treaties or the pacts or the agreements which we have signed in the past, they have not delivered. So as far as new agreements which we have to sign, we have to be very, very cautious on that. Any of the FTAs or any of the agreements which we are. But that is something which you have to do it on the larger scale, at the larger level. But to address the external headwinds, first of all, you have to address your domestic problems which you are facing. Obviously, there are problems at the global front, trade is going down, etc. And in terms of, doing what is required for the domestic economy, FICCI has suggested an agenda for growth to the government. I would just point out here that there are 6 key areas which the government needs to do, immediately or in the medium term. As Sunil also said, that there are low-hanging fruits in terms of pending legislation. There are some low-hanging fruits, but if you look at it in totality, there are legislations which are immediately, which are a necessity right now. Especially like small sectors, MSME bill. That is something which is required. You have to push up MSME growth, so that is required. Then you have pending bills in labor and land laws. So labor reforms are absolutely a necessity. Previous government couldn't do it. Although GST, RERA, IBC, these were difficult reforms, but they did it.
We have the 4 labor codes that can probably be, be kick-started, and we can see that as far as this government is concerned. So that will be a good step.
Yes, and this time the government is in a position to, push these reforms. So these reforms are one part of it. Then you have typically important policies, like e-commerce policy, or maybe retail policy, as you say. New industrial policy aimed at a great framework, where the way GST has worked on cooperative federalism, you have a platform, GST Council. So new industrial policy looks at a platform where states and center would come together and work for, betterment of industry or easing the business scenario, the doing business scenario. Then the third part, which is very, very important at present, both in terms of immediate impact and in terms of medium-term impact also, that is reducing the cost of doing business in this country. There are 2 components on that. One component, Ambassador touched on that is reducing the corporate tax rate for bigger companies. For smaller companies, government has already done that. To 25% it has been brought down. But for the large part of the business, which gives profit, the corporate tax rate is still 30%. So that needs to be brought down. Second part is your cost, this interest cost. We have today the highest real interest rate in the world. For an economy which is growing fastest, you have highest real interest rate. That needs to be brought down immediately. 100 to 150 basis point cut is a necessity right now. And that RBI has to do, but the government has to work in tandem, government has to push for. Then comes the legislations or the bills or the laws which you have already brought in, modifications in those bills.
Right.
Like GST, he mentioned that. Now GST also has to be broad-based, plus the rates have to be restructured so that your overall minimum rate or the average rate tax incidence comes down substantially. It cannot be more than 14-15%. At best 16%. Right now it is quite high still. And then two big areas. One is your rural distress. So farmers problems have to be tackled, that you will have to do. For economy to grow at a higher pace, that is required. Direct income support scheme is a very good scheme, it needs to be strengthened. But unless you go to the rural areas and strengthen your infrastructure like warehousing, irrigation, etc. So if you are going giving 1.5 lakh crore rupees in different kind of schemes to the farmers, that will be a short-term measure. But if you create with that kind of amount, that kind of money, a rural infrastructure, which allows you to preserve fruits, vegetables, etc., and then also irrigation facilities, it will be a longer-term solution to the farmers' issue.
Sure.
And the last one, I would say, allow me to, and the last one is your job creation.
Sure.
You have different windows, new age economy, new age businesses are coming like Ola, Uber. Then you have startups coming up. Government has supported entrepreneurship in a huge way, big way. But now you have to focus on the job creating sectors like textiles and various other sectors.
Sure.
Maybe you can create an employment generation ministry. FICCI has suggested that. So that could be one.
Yeah, let's see what happens really as far as that is concerned on this issue of agriculture and doubling up of farmers' income by 2022. I'm going to come back to that in just a bit. I'd like to go ask Sunil Jain his views on that. But before that, Jain Dasgupta, this issue of FDI, do you believe that we need to open up FDI in other sectors and maybe even 100% FDI in certain sectors? That is one. Second is multi-brand retail could be another thing, and of course e-commerce as well.
The FDI flow, of course, if you take the foreign portfolio investment, has slumped in May. Between February and April, I think there was about an inflow of about $10 billion. But then it came down to about $837 million or so. So there is, of course, a reason that there was some apprehension that there may be political instability. So it has to be seen whether that was the main reason and whether it picks up or not. But quite apart from that, the problem about FDI is that we need to have FDI coming in the manufacturing sector also. It should not only come in the form of investments in the stock market. And as far as multi-brand retail is concerned, there we have, of course, been amending the policy. The last one took place on the 26th of December 2018. Now, it is a work in progress. Of course, it has been tweaked many times. But it is also related to the e-marketplace, the e-commerce policy. And the draft policy was put out by the Ministry of Commerce in February 2019. So a final shape has to be given to that, so that investors from abroad who want to come in, they know for a fact that this is going to be the policy for the next 5 years, that they have a stable, predictable environment in which to invest, and they can take the risks. And there should be a kind of a moratorium that, apart from minor tweaking, there would not be any major changes wrought to the policy over the next 5 years. That is absolutely essential to have the investors repose trust and confidence in India as a destination for their investments. The last point I wanted to mention is that the emerging markets have been showing a lot of volatility, and India is also part of that group. And investments are going out, not in terms of the old FDI, but portfolio investments are flowing out from many of the emerging markets. So that also affects us, because it affects the current account deficit, for instance. So we have to be careful, and we have to provide an enabling environment, because it is, as you mentioned, the external headwinds. Two of the things which come to mind very readily are the oil problem, because we will have to take some decision about whether to buy oil from Iran or to completely shut it out.
This issue of oil and of course the tariff war between the US and China, I'm just going to come back to you, for that. But before that, let me go across to Sunil Jain now. Sunil Jain, I'm going to take the point that Santosh Tiwari was making forward. The issue of the rural economy, the government too has time and again stressed that, the farmers' income should be doubled by 2022. Do we see us going in that direction? What really needs to be done so as to ensure that the rural economy gets a boost?
I think it's really ironic, and I mean it's even and unfortunate that the government didn't do much on the rural economy, because almost the day that Mr. Modi came to power in 2014, he by the Shanta Kumar committee, which looked at what measures could be taken, and basically what that report said was that India is giving 150,000-160,000 crore worth of subsidies every year to farmers, and most of these get taken up by the richer farmers. So instead of that, we should just give them, cash per hectare or things like that. Now that's something which the Prime Minister can still do. So if he does that, I think a large part of the problem in the rural economy can get taken over. But whether he does it or not is something we have to see. All
right. That is as far as the rural economy is concerned. You seem to have an issue with your earpiece. We'll come back to you for another reaction. But Santosh Tiwari, let's take the discussion forward now, and talk about some of the other aspects. Taxation has been spoken about. We've also spoken about bank mergers. We've spoken about e-commerce, multi-brand retail, and labor reforms as well. Probably have missed out land reforms, but much has been spoken about land reforms. Let's talk about privatization. The government tried to sell Air India. That did not happen. Do we need to take a relook at that, maybe, privatize Air India? Once again, efforts should be made in that direction. And also, what about other non-strategic PSUs?
See, we have a roadmap. Sorry. Niti Aayog has created or prepared a complete roadmap about privatization or disinvestment that has been given to the government. You have to look at disinvestment. The direct tax growth rate would also be a little bit lowered. Would be made realistic. So where from you get the money for public investment or on these schemes, which this government has targeted? This is in a different context, which is very feasible. Government would have been inclined to do this, or take this route about 2 years back, but right now, it is not inclined to take that route, whatever you get from the government, But still, along with this consolidation in the banking arena, banking sector, you must look at some kind of privatization, whenever, if not now, at least there has to be a plan where, you will bring in more and more private players. And as far as Air India is concerned, its situation is known to everyone, for a longer period of time. Obviously, when the private sector comes in and takes over, some industry, there are problems, there are issues, but in the longer run, the industry or the chances of it getting revived is much brighter. So that is one route which the government has to decide. But obviously, Air India like company, when you take a decision, when the government takes a decision, it has to be taken in larger context.
Right.
So Prime Minister Narendra Modi's government has taken strong measures in the past, in the previous avatar also, and in this avatar also it is expected that there would be some measures like this one or in terms of privatization, which nobody has thought of. Because they have to bring in money, they have to generate resources.
Right.
And where from you generate resources if the investment is not picking up? And don't expect investment to pick up in 1 quarter or 2 quarters or 3 quarters.
Sure. Let me take the point that you're making forward. Sunil Jain, this issue, when you're talking about privatization, we have to talk about private investment as well. That has been slow to pick up, really. What can we expect as far as the private investment front is concerned? And how do we pick it up?
Well, this is a point which Santosh is making, that don't expect growth to pick up, very soon in the next few quarters, because as I said, banks are still in trouble, the corporate sector still has a balance sheet problem, and credit growth because of the NBFCs is slowing down. So it will take time, but the measure that I talked about, so if for example the government slashes levies in India on the mining sector are about 30% of revenues today. Globally it's about 8 to 10%. If the government is able to slash those levies to bring Indian policies on a par with those internationally, I think you will get a burst of investment. This burst of investment will not take you to the 34-35% levels that Ambassador Dasgupta was talking about, but it will take you from 29 to 30 or keep you stable for a few years, which is a very good thing here.
Okay, closing comments now from all my guests, starting first with you, Ambassador Jayant Das Gupta. So, double-digit growth is something of the past, something that we probably can't aspire to get in the near future?
Double-digit growth by 2022 is an aspirational objective. It is setting the bar high, but we have to take steps first, and one of them which is imperative is to step up public investment in agriculture, whether they are by way of irrigation facilities, building warehouses, building roads, cleaning up the agricultural marketing mess, and providing the farmers with just price. And also the minimum support price mechanism has to be modified very radically, and direct income support, I would support that point of view. That is the way to go, and the direct benefit transfer of to farmers. And one of the things which needs to be done, which has been done in some states at least, is to record not only the current owners of pieces of land, but also the sharecroppers who are tilling that piece of land, so that investments from the domestic sector can also flow into agriculture. But public investments in agriculture has to be stepped up without a doubt in order to boost agricultural growth, which is we will need to have 9 or 10% growth to double the farmer's income over the next few years. But at the current moment, it is languishing around 3% or below that nationally. So that is something which we need to do.
So, but are you in favor of income guarantee schemes? Are you in favor in subsidies? Do you believe that we need to do away with them and look at some other reforms as far as agriculture is concerned, or do you believe that these schemes and subsidies?
So we have to bear both in mind that food prices have to be, cannot be allowed to rise beyond a certain limit, and the farmers also have to get a fair price.
Right.
So subsidies will perhaps not be, we will not be able to dispense with subsidies completely, but the point is it should be better targeted, and it should go to the people who deserve it the most, the poorer farmers, the smaller landowners, rather than the larger ones. The second point I wanted to make in this context is that contract farming has to be allowed. Right. And that is something which is not being allowed in many states. So that is the second point. The third point is, of course, the Agriculture Produce Market Committee Act of old, for which the central government has been persistently asking the state governments to repeal the act, and it has now circulated a model marketing
reform measures, how this government bringing administrative and policy measures. So the speed of these measures, would define what kind of growth rate you will have in future.
Right.
And we are quite optimistic that the kind of government you have today, with Nirmala Sitharaman as Finance Minister and Prime Minister Narendra Modi coming with such great confidence, we expect that the reform speed would only be fastened. You will see tough reforms, difficult reforms in the coming months and years in this tenure of this government.
Sure. And Sunil Jain, close the show for us with your concluding remarks on what kind of direction can we expect from the budget.
Well, I think the budget is going to be talking about reducing subsidies and things like that. But I think the larger point is that, if we can even sustain a 7.5% growth over the next few years, that itself is going to be a big challenger. So, this 8%, 9%, 10% is not going to happen. The overall direction for this government has to be, wherever possible, try and move towards market pricing. Get rid of subsidies. When you talk about subsidies in agriculture, the biggest problem in agriculture is that because we don't have a pan-Indian market, the farmers get about 250 to 300,000 crore rupees less than what they should get. So until we start getting to a market economy, the people are not going to get the benefit of it. I think that is the big lesson that we have to keep in mind, and none of this is possible unless Mr. Modi himself is invested in it. So far, he has not shown so much sign of wanting to move towards the market economy. We have to hope that in this current government, he will want to do that.
All right. All right then, with that, we'll call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. Those were the challenges really as far as India's economy is concerned. We discussed a few ways forward as well. Reforms and continuous reforms is the way forward as far as India's economy is concerned, is what the panelists are suggesting. With that, I'll call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. See you again next time.